If this case, was actually going somewhere, it meant Trump's legal troubles weren't just noise. They weren't just media spin. They were real. Carolyn swallowed that thought before it could show on her face. Instead, she leaned in. You're acting like you just dropped a smoking gun. But let's be real, you're throwing breadcrumbs and hoping people are too dumb to notice the missing pieces. She turned to the camera, speaking directly to the audience now. This is what the media does. They manipulate. They push narratives. They want you outraged. They want you scared, and they want you to believe they're the ones with all the answers. Rebecca watched her, unshaken, almost like she had expected this. That's an interesting deflection, Rebecca said. But let me ask you something, Carolyn. If this clip really is nothing, why are you so rattled? Silence. That. He gave a brief nod to the crowd, adjusting the microphone as the applause continued. Folks, he began, his voice steady, familiar. It's good to be here with you tonight. The response was immediate, more cheers, scattered whistles. He waited, letting the excitement settle before continuing. We're at a turning point, he said. A moment where we have to decide, do we keep pushing forward, building a country we can be proud of? Or do we let the same voices, the same broken policies, keep dragging us down? A wave of agreement swept through the crowd. Some clapped, others shouted their approval. But let's be real, he added, leaning slightly into the microphone. We've got a fight on our hands. And that's why we're here, to talk about what comes next. He launched into his speech, his tone shifting between measured and passionate. He spoke about the economy, about crime, about policies he believed were failing the American people. Each sentence was met with energy from the audience, applause, affirmations, the occasional call from the back of the room. Then, in the midst of it all, a voice cut through the air. It wasn't a shout from a supporter or an enthusiastic response. It was deliberate, pointed, sharp enough to make heads turn, talking about the cost of everything, groceries, gas, rent. They're frustrated, not just with one party or one policy, but with a system that's failed them for decades. He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping the audience. Some nodded, others clapped, sensing where he was going. You see, Andrea, he continued, the difference between you and me is that I don't just talk about these issues from behind a desk. I see them firsthand. I talk to small business owners who can't afford to keep their doors open. I hear from parents who are choosing between rent and groceries. And I know that the solutions you and your network push, higher taxes, more regulation, more government control, aren't helping them. They're hurting them. A few cheers broke out, followed by applause. Andrea Holt shifted in her seat but didn't look away. Vance leaned in slightly. So, when you ask me what I say to the people struggling, I say this, I hear you. I know what you're going through, and I'm fighting like hell to make sure the system works for you, not for bureaucrats, not for career politicians, and certainly not for media elites who think they know what's best. The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause. The energy that had briefly dipped surged back, stronger than before. Andrea opened her mouth as if to respond, but the moment had shifted. The audience was no longer waiting for her next question. They were standing, clapping, voices rising in approval. Vance straightened, adjusting his sleeves. Now, he said, his voice carrying over the noise, let's talk about real solutions. The conversation wasn't over, but in that moment, it was clear, J.D. Vance had won this round. Talking about crime in their neighborhoods, about schools failing their kids, about losing jobs to policies cooked up by people who never have to live with the consequences. A few people in the audience clapped, sensing the shift in momentum. But let's be honest, he said, straightening, you're not really asking me that question for them, y'all. You're asking it to frame a narrative to put me on the defensive. That's how this works, right? The crowd rumbled again, this time louder. Andrea's jaw tensed slightly, but she kept her composure. But Vance wasn't finished. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Andrea Holt, microphone in hand, kept her posture firm, her expression unreadable, but anyone paying close attention could see the slight shift in her stance, the way her fingers curled just a little tighter around the mic. She hadn't expected that. J.D. Vance, still at the podium, let the weight Of his words settle, he wasn't rushing, he wasn't filling the silence with nervous chatter, he was owning it. The crowd wasn't sure whether to erupt or wait. Some supporters exchanged glances, their anticipation thick in the air. A few reporters in the press section scribbled furiously, their cameras rolling, capturing every second. Then Vance spoke again. You see, Andrea, he said, his voice measured but firm, the reason people are frustrated isn't because politicians give bad speeches, it's because they feel like no one actually listens to them, not the government, not the media, not the people who claim to speak on their behalf. Andrea out by bad policy and empty promises. They don't need a journalist from a major network to tell them they're struggling. They live it. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heavier now, not just agreement but something deeper, recognition. Vance let the moment linger, then took a step back from the podium, glancing around the room. The difference between us, Andrea, is that I don't need to script my answers. I don't need to shape a narrative before I walk into a room. I just have to tell the truth. The applause came fast and loud. Supporters rose to their feet, clapping, cheering. A few whistled. Andrea Holt, still gripping the microphone, shifted in her seat. She had walked into this moment ready for a debate. But debates require control, and she no longer had it. J.D. Vance wasn't finished. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to draw the crowd in. So, Andrea, you asked me what I say to the people who feel left behind. Here's my answer: I see them. I hear them. And I'm standing right here, fighting for them, whether your network wants to cover that or not. The cheers surged again, filling the room. Andrea exhaled, her expression neutral, but the shift in the energy was undeniable. Whatever story she had come in expecting to write, it wasn't this. J.D. Vance straightened, adjusting the microphone one last time. Now, he said, his tone firm, unwavering, who's ready to talk about real solutions? Crowd roared. And just like that, the moment belonged to him. Out, and no one in power, not in Washington, not in your newsroom, bothers to ask them what they actually need. The applause built again, louder this time. And you know what the worst part is, Vance said, his voice dropping just slightly, making the audience lean in. Andrea swallowed. You're going to leave here tonight and go back to your studio, and you're still not going to report on what these people are telling you right now. You'll say I deflected, you'll call this populist rhetoric, you'll find a way to make sure no one out there watching at home actually hears what the people in this room want you to hear. The room erupted. Andrea's jaw tensed. She wasn't shaking, she was too experienced for that, but her composure had cracked just slightly. The weight of the moment was pressing down on her. Vance let the applause roll for a few seconds before delivering his final point. So, Andrea, he said, let me ask you a question. The audience quieted. Andrea's grip tightened on the microphone. If you really care about the people being left behind, he said, his tone even measured, why does it take a politician calling you out on a stage like this for you to finally pay attention to them? Silence. Not a single word, not from Andrea, not from the press section, not even from the people in the crowd. Vance didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just let the words sit there heavy in the air. And that's when everything changed. The silence wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, the kind that made people shift in their seats, clear their throats, glance around as if searching for someone else to break it. Andrea Holt still had the microphone in her hand, but for the first time that night she didn't know what to do with it. Her usual confidence, they acknowledge it, whether they liked it or not. Vance exhaled, rolling his sleeves up a little higher as he took in the room. The crowd wasn't just engaged, they were locked in, energized in a way that couldn't be faked. He had seen it before, in diners and town halls across the state. People weren't just hungry for leadership, they were starving for honesty. He let a small smile cross his face, then leaned back into the microphone. Now, he said, his voice calm, confident, let's get back to why we're really here. The crowd erupted once more, not just in applause, but in something deeper, approval, vindication. Andrea Holt shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her notepad, but she didn't speak again. She didn't have to. The moment was over. And J.D. Vance had won. Acknowledge that something real had just taken place, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered was the people in this room. Vance exhaled, rolling his shoulders back slightly, his posture loose, unbothered. Now, he said, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, if nobody else wants to cut me off, can I get back to my speech? The crowd roared, cheers, laughter, applause, all of it blending into a wave of raw, unfiltered emotion. But there was one man in the second row, older, probably in his late 60s, who wasn't clapping. Instead, he raised A hand. Vance noticed him immediately. Go ahead, sir. He said, nodding in his direction. The man stood, his voice steady but filled with the years of wear. Senator, he said, I've been voting for over 40 years and I've watched politicians from both sides come through towns like mine, shake hands, make promises, and then disappear. So why should I believe you're any different? The room quieted again, not with tension but with expectation. Vance didn't hesitate. You shouldn't, he said. A few surprised murmurs flickered through the audience. Andrea Holt raised an eyebrow. You shouldn't believe me just because I say something that sounds good up here, Vance continued. You shouldn't believe anyone who gets on a stage and tells you exactly what you want to hear. He paused, scanning the room. But I'll tell you what you can do, he said. You can hold me accountable. You can watch what I do when the cameras aren't rolling, when there's no election on the horizon. You can see if I show up in your town when there's nothing in it for me. A beat passed, then another, and if I don't. Vance shrugged. Then don't vote for me. The older man studied him for a moment, then he gave a small nod, not of agreement but of acknowledgement. Vance turned back to the crowd. This whole system is broken, he said. We all know it. The people in power lie to you.